Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hello guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm glad you could be with us today. And if you've been listening the past several episodes, you know that I've been sharing much of my own story and journey, kind of cascading into the time that I met my wife and we got married, and then our story together from there forward. And I'm really excited today because I have a very special guest, which is my wonderful, beautiful, awesome wife, Sheri. And she's going to join us today and just share some of her heart and her thoughts about our story and everything we've been through together. So do you want to say hi, babe?
Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be here today.
I'm glad you're here too, babe. Well, as you know, I've been sharing my story the past several episodes, and you and I know our story better than anybody, I guess. Isn't that right?
I would hope so.
And I think it's fair to say that, you know, what I affectionately refer to as the dark days of our marriage, the early years. We've been married 32 years now, and I think it's fair to say that at least the first half of our marriage, the first 16 years, maybe even more than that, was pretty much a total mess. Would you agree?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely would agree to that.
We were two just very deeply broken people who came together, and we really didn't understand what a mess we were. In fact, as a pastor and as a professional counselor, I've now come to the place where I believe that most people have no idea what they're getting in on when they end up getting married. They don't necessarily know the person that they're marrying. And I don't think that you and I really understood what we were getting ourselves into on September 17th, 1983, when we walked down the aisle and said, "I do."
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I don't think either one of us realized how messed up we each were, or how messed up the other person was. We were pretty much, going into it blind.
Yeah, it's amazing how, you look at a person on the outside and they look pretty, they look cute, they look all put together, but you don't necessarily know their story. And one thing's for sure, when you get married, you don't just marry the person, you marry their story. And it's a package deal. And I remember you sharing before this metaphor of kind of walking down the aisle with these backpacks. People have this. Do you remember that? Could you
sure.
share a little bit of that?
Yeah, just when you're walking down the aisle, you're walking with a backpack full of all of your stories of your life. And, I know I didn't realize what was in my own backpack, and I know you didn't realize what was in yours. So it was,
It was kind of a big mess.
Kind of a big mess, yeah.
We both had those big backpacks, that's for sure.
Although we didn't realize it, of course. We were walking down the aisle with stars in our eyes thinking, white picket fence and happily ever after, but it didn't necessarily work out that way.
Right. One of the things that God has really taught us since then is just the significance of this whole concept of stories, and that everybody has a story. And the fact is, your story is kind of like your shadow. No matter how fast you run, you can't get away from your shadow. And a person's story has a way of following them through life and then even into their marriage, of course, and affecting them maybe in ways that they really don't necessarily understand. And in my backpack, or said another way, in my story, I had all this very hurtful stuff. My relationship with my dad wasn't very great. Issues with my family of origin. I found my dad's pornography when I was 10 or 11 years old. I was sexually abused by two older women during my adolescence. And then, of course, you had your backpack, or you had your story, your family of origin. You were raped when you were 13, your promiscuity, your abortion at 17, your suicide attempts. So we just had all this history, all this story, all this backpack that we were bringing to one another. And I guess we just didn't really understand what a mess we were and the implications it was going to have in our relationship and on our marriage.
Yeah, it's true. I think that when I go to a wedding and I think, I wonder what's in their backpacks as they walk down the aisle and all starry-eyed and excited and anticipating this wonderful new life together. I just wonder, what they're going to have to deal with in their marriages.
Right. Yeah, that's an intriguing concept. So we end up at the altar together on September 17th, 1983. And how long would you say that it took us to figure out that we were kind of a mess together?
Um, about 12 hours. I think it was the honeymoon. It was
Right.
like, uh-oh.
Wow, isn't that amazing? It wasn't
Yeah,
it wasn't measured in years or months or weeks or even days,
right.
but
It
literally
was,
hours
yeah,
from our wedding,
yeah,
we were kind of in big trouble. And what do
yeah.
you remember about that? How would you put words to it?
I don't know. I think I just remember being shut down emotionally and sexually on the honeymoon. And I think that was of course, a huge red flag. I guess I don't know what I was thinking then. Maybe what, um, was it just from all the activity of the wedding or what? But I was just emotionally a mess on the honeymoon.
I remember that. I remember feeling really confused by it that we had just gotten married and it just was obvious that you were very shut down emotionally, relationally, sexually. I know the event did happen on our wedding night, but it was obvious to me that it's like your body was there, but you weren't really there, you know.
Right.
And I knew something was wrong. I thought maybe it's just the helter skelter of the wedding, and things will be better tomorrow. And but tomorrow never came, and we were off and running, and it just seemed like we were a mess, literally from our very first day.
Yeah, I think we call it, a lot of times when we talk about it, we call it the train wreck.
Right, right. That's for sure. That's a very fair term, I think. Well, how would you put words to why you were so shut down, babe? What was it about your heart, your story, that brought you to a place where you were so shut down in that way?
Well, I don't know. Of course, I understand it now. Back then, it was very, very confusing and upsetting. And I honestly, I didn't understand it at the time. And because whenever you and I would attempt intimacy between us, I I just would feel um, feel a lot of anger. I would feel a lot of rage come up inside of me. I remember feeling like I was being raped. Not that you were doing anything in particular to make me feel that way, but something about sex and intimacy made me feel anger and rage. And so after a while, I'm like, I don't want anything to do with this if it makes me feel this way. But of course, had absolutely no understanding of what was going on.
Right. And of course, through our therapeutic process, years later, we would begin to understand the stories of our life. And as God invited you into your own story and you started unpacking it and you kind of started connecting the dots, dealing with some things that represented the deepest hurt and pains of your life, things that you had never, ever dealt with before, like being raped when you were 13 and then your promiscuity and the abortion. And the fact of the matter is that at the epicenter of the issue of sex was the reality that I just always use the word yucky. It's like sex represented the deepest hurt and pain and shame of your life and your heart and your soul, and it made you feel yucky. And so there was
Well,
like this.
I think yucky is even a nice word for it. I mean, it literally, I felt rage, but I didn't understand it.
Yeah,
So
that's
I think it's more profound than just yucky.
right. That's powerful, babe. Yeah. So there was just all this unsettled business between you and yourself, and you and God, and you and your past, and you and sex, and as a result, you just were in a place where it was profoundly difficult for you to function
Mm-hmm.
sexually in anything that resembled a healthy manner,
Right.
And then, of course, on top of all that was the fact that you were married to a pretty ignorant husband. Is that fair to say?
I don't know if that's a good word.
Well, the thing is that you certainly had your issues with sex.
Yeah.
That was like on you, a
Yeah.
lot of your history and story. Before we even met, you had your issues just like I had mine. But then on top of it, when we did get married, there was a lot of relational issues between the two of us that really complicated things and kind of made the situation go from bad to worse. Because I think what was going on for me, kind of from my end of it, was, of course, I was a young man with a sexual addiction at this point early in our marriage, which I didn't understand. I didn't understand that I had a sexual addiction. And I think the sexual energy that was alive in me was very misdirected. In the Power of Purity conference, I do a session called Love Sex versus Lust Sex. And I think at that point in my life and my heart and my sexual self, my sexuality very much had a lust orientation, And therefore, I think even though we were married, the way that I would move toward you, kind of my motivation, and even when I would touch you, I think it felt familiar to you. And you could tell, maybe it's a crude way to say it, but in a way, I was like many of the other guys from your past that essentially were willing to take advantage of you and use you in a way,
Yeah.
and something made you feel yucky, know.
Yeah. Well, and of course, like I already said, I didn't understand that at the time, and I just felt I was just such a I was just emotionally shut down too, which was part of my past history and story. Really hated myself very much, and just being unable to respond sexually just confirmed my self-hatred. And for years we didn't really even consider that you had issues with a sexual addiction. That wasn't even really named or labeled for a long time, because for many years we were both trying to figure out what's wrong with Sheri, because I felt like I had this label on my head for years and years in our marriage. Sheri has a problem with sex,
Right.
which of course was part of the problem, but it wasn't the whole problem. And so for many, many, many years, our whole focus was on trying to figure out what the heck is wrong with Sheri, because she's got a problem with sex.
Right. And then to add insult to injury, the way I treated you was so terrible because I just didn't handle it well. I was a young man with a sexual addiction. I had my own issues and hurts and brokenness from the past, just like you did. And when we weren't able to function sexually together in our marriage, I didn't handle it well. I took it personally. Of course, I felt hurt. I felt rejected. Here I am struggling with sex my whole life and acting out sexually in ways that I knew God would not approve of. And finally, I'm married. I have a woman, a wife, and I can finally have sex, legal sex in the eyes of God.
And it's supposed to be okay.
Right. And God won't even be mad at me,
Yeah.
And wouldn't you know, the woman that I'm married to wants nothing to do with sex. So I would feel hurt and confused and upset and disoriented, and then I'd take it out on you. I'd be angry.
And you would really you stopped talking to me. You wouldn't talk to me. So,
right.
Very early on in our very first tiny little house, I can remember that. I remember one time just being so confused and upset, and I stood in the middle of this tiny little house and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Why won't you talk to me?"
Right, I remember that. That's terrible. And it was a way, I guess it was a way for me to punish you. I probably was doing it on purpose. Maybe sometimes I was just overwhelmed and didn't even know what I was doing, but I knew that I felt hurt by you. I felt rejected by you. I felt angry. I was mad at you. I was mad at God. Sometimes I would want to punish you. And I remember those dark days when I literally sometimes would not talk to you for days at a time. I was so filled with contempt and anger.
So it was like this vicious cycle. I already hated myself. I was very confused. I didn't understand what was going on. I couldn't have sex with you without feeling this rage. And then you weren't talking to me. So it was like this vicious cycle that we just never got out of. And it just kept getting worse and worse and worse.
Right. It was so terrible, for sure. And we lived that way for a long time, for years and years and years. And eventually what happened is, we were very dysfunctional, I guess in every way. I think relationally, emotionally, sexually, verbally. We didn't know how to talk or communicate.
Right. Yep.
And what I began to do, I think, in a short matter of time is I began to act out because I still had my sexual addiction, and I wasn't getting sex from my wife, and I think sometimes I felt justified. And I felt angry at you and angry at God, and then I didn't even care. I just thought, fine, if my wife won't even have sex with me, then I'll just take care of it myself. And so I was filled with lust. I would masturbate compulsively. I didn't do it a lot, but several times I went to strip clubs on the east side. I would look at pornography on occasion, although I never did have a real big problem with porn. And the big thing is that I eventually began to act out sexually, and I became involved in several different adulterous affairs during the course of our marriage, including an emotional affair with your sister, and then a sexual affair with your best friend, who was my best friend's wife at the time. And that's one of the most shameful things about my life. So, Jesus said in John 10:10, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And our situation was going from bad to worse. And without a doubt, the devil was just trying to close the deal on the destruction of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's hard to even really reflect on it. I know we talk about our stories and all that, but just like right now, sitting here talking about it, it's hard to even imagine that was us, like that was our lives. Like, who were those people and why were they acting like that? And why were we stuck for so long?
It seems like a different lifetime
It
ago,
does.
doesn't it?
It really does. Yeah.
And it's amazing how you look back at things in your own life like that, and you're ashamed and you have regrets.
Yeah.
And you're horrified, and you think to yourself, oh, my God, who was I? It's like, what was I thinking?
Yeah.
How could I possibly make the decisions I apparently was making and rationalize it in my own brain and heart and just live the way that I was living? And all I can say is praise God that He worked deeply and powerfully in our marriage, and He's delivered us from all that stuff and is still delivering us.
Yeah. I think if it hadn't been for the fact that we were believers in Christ, that God was central in our hearts and lives, and we really wanted to honor God, even though we were so messed up. I think if it hadn't been for that huge aspect, we for certainly would be divorced. I know that you and I both at different times were despairing of life. I wanted to kill myself. I wanted out because the pain was just so great, and it was just so hard and confusing and upsetting. And we lived in the same house like that for just years and years and years.
I remember that, yeah. I used to, when I was younger, I used to sit in judgment of people that would take their own life. I was that stupid, I thought, I saw these people as pathetic human beings who were weak and pathetic, and how could you ever get to the place where you would want to take your own life? And in the darkest of days, when you and I were just such a mess and everything was so terrible, I remember coming to the place where I was despairing of life myself, and I thought to myself, if this is my life, I don't want it anymore. There's just too much pain. And I felt like God gave me a metaphor at that time. You know how much it hurts to get burned. And imagine if there was a person like in this metaphorical fire that they could never, ever escape. For some reason, they're just stuck in this fire, and they're being perpetually burned in this perpetual pain and agony, that in a short matter of time, a person would come to the place where they would think, I just want to die. I cannot take this pain anymore. I have to escape it. And I think both of us were in such pain that we had those terrible thoughts of self-harm, And
of course, we're not condoning it. We're just saying that that's how desperate we felt, because God, if there's somebody out there listening that feels that way right now, there is definitely hope.
Absolutely. Praise God.
And we're living proof of that.
Right. Praise be to God. Well, at some point in that mess, as all that was unfolding over these years, I was involved in this sexual affair with your best friend. The affair went on for a long time, 5 years. Although when it all did finally come out into the light, she said that we had been together 10 different times. I didn't think it was that much. But anyway, just to give a sense of regularity, 10 times over 5 years, that would be an average of every 6 months. The point being, it wasn't a perpetual, constant thing for 5 years. And I think part of that was just the cycle that I myself would go through. I would act out, and then I would feel so terrible and so guilty and so ashamed of myself. And I'd tell myself, Tony, what are you doing, you idiot? You can never do this again. And I'd try so hard to not do it again. And maybe months would pass, and then something would happen again. But eventually I came to this point under the ministry of what I call God's heavy hand, where I just knew I cannot live like this anymore. It's a terrible day when you look at yourself in the mirror and you're disgusted by what you see. You don't even like yourself. You realize that you're living in your life and acting out in a way that's in violation of your very own conscience. And so I just knew that I had to confess. I had to tell you. And I think it was really an act of desperation to try to get us to change. And I remember the night that I came to you to confess what I had been doing, that I had had these affairs and I was having this affair. And I believe I said to you, I don't want to get divorced. And I guess you can divorce me if you want, but I want to fight for our marriage. All I know is we cannot live this way anymore. We can't live like this. It's horrible. And I'm willing to try to work on it and go to counseling if you are. And I remember, you tell me, what do you remember about that night?
Well, I still was in a place in my life where I was still very numb. And I really, when we talked about it, when you came to me, I can't remember it super crystal clear, but basically, I didn't have a lot of emotional reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was so numb. Not only that I was numb, but I was also still in a position of, well, we both were, where everything was my fault. So it was like, well, of course this is happening. It's my fault. So how can I get mad at him? So I think that's the position my heart was in. And so we actually immediately got into counseling, and it actually took me about 2 years, crazy as that seems, to actually start thawing out enough, feeling enough to actually start getting mad. So, yeah.
That was all part of the process.
Right.
But I do remember that you said to me that you didn't want our marriage to end. Mm-hmm. And we cried together that night, and then we prayed together. And whether we knew it or not, that was a significant stepping stone, because I think it was literally that week, within days, we went to our first professional counseling session, and we started that process of counseling. And in the end, that process lasted over 6 years.
Yeah.
And I like to say now that those 6 years were both wonderful and terrible in the way of God's kingdom, that when God is dealing with you, it's good because God's dealing with you and trying to perpetrate healing upon your heart and life. But it's terrible because it's really hard to look at stuff and face your story and deal with the hurtful, shameful things of your own heart and life. And so it can be hard to follow God's redemptive path for your life, but it's necessary.
Yeah, I remember that in those first few days, I either asked you or you told me I could ask you whatever I wanted to know, you would tell me. And I think the one thing that I wanted to know was if you had had sex with her in our bed.
Right.
Which had happened. And so at that point, I wouldn't sleep in our bed anymore. I didn't want to sleep on that mattress. I didn't want to sleep in there anymore.
Rightfully so.
Yeah. So I think we went out and bought a whole new bedroom set. Not furniture, but I mean mattress and sheets and comforter and all that stuff.
I remember that, babe, and I think that was very, very rightful. I'm so ashamed that I did that I would bring another woman not only into our marriage, into our lives, but into our home, and then into our bedroom and into our bed, our marriage bed, your bed. And when you found that out, of course, you said you would never sleep in that bed again and wanted to get rid of that bed.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I guess it was years later I realized that I really got off easier than I probably should have, because I think for real there could be a lot of women who would have literally said, I will not go in that house again. I don't want this house anymore.
Well,
and if you would have demanded a new house, I think that would have been appropriate.
Well, I think our counselor at the time, I'm trying to think of how that actually happened, but basically, like I said, it took me a couple of years to actually get mad. Oh, and he had said that I was very unusual because most women would have taken everything out of that bedroom and just thrown it out the window, thrown your clothes out the window, through whatever, just it. Most women would have been incredibly angry. But at that point, I wasn't feeling the anger and hurt. However, one of the things about me that God really worked on was that I didn't understand this about myself either, but there's outward anger and then there's passive aggressiveness. One thing I remember about that, when we went and bought the mattress, I thought I wanted a whole new comforter and all that stuff. And I remember spending, taking the credit card and I'm going to spend as much as I can. Kind of that was my way of being angry, spending money on the credit card to buy all new stuff.
I see. Mm-hmm.
So that's just a tiny microcosm of, even though I wasn't outwardly angry, I think I really was angry, and I have a tendency to be passive aggressive.
Right.
And that's just one example of that.
Yeah, and as you've already alluded to, I think maybe in hindsight, there's two main reasons that you were in that place at the time. One was just because you had never dealt with any of this stuff from your own past, and in a very real way, your own heart was frozen like an iceberg. Mm-hmm. And it was just starting to thaw out through this process that God was inviting us into.
Right.
And the second part you alluded to is that I think, especially in the early days, you were blaming yourself for everything, almost as if, in a way, you were saying, well, you were blaming yourself, and which, of course, wasn't fair, because the fact is, you certainly contributed to the damage of our marriage, but I also was contributing to the damage of our marriage, and we were just two big messes, and when you put two big messes together, you get an even bigger mess,
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, guys, I need to interrupt at this point, but please come back for our next episode to hear the continuation of Sheri's voice. And if you know somebody that might benefit from this podcast, please invite a friend to listen.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.